Good evening, I'm David Kramer with Alaska Weather. As always, please visit our website, weather.gov/Alaska. You can get any updates to our forecast or check out any watches, warnings, or advisories that we might have out for your area. You can also call our weather info line, 1-800-472-0391, get any updates to the forecast through that means as well. And you can email me at the address at the bottom of the screen, david.kramer@noaa.gov. Starting off, we'll take a look at our fire danger. We have an area of high fire danger out over the Yukon Flats area, another smaller area down in the lower Yukon River area, and then also we have one in the southeastern portions of the Copper River Basin. If you're in any of these areas, be mindful that the fire danger is high for today. Taking a look at our satellite imagery, before we jump into our loops, we'll take a quick minute to note if you have been seeing some smoke or haze out over your area for much of mainland Alaska and some areas down in the Panhandle as well, we are getting some smoke in from northeastern Russia where they do have some wildfires out there. That's bringing in that smoke to our area, and we have been able to see some of that, a little bit hazy, a little bit smoky. So be mindful of that for many locations around the mainland and down in the Panhandle as well. So taking a look at our satellite imagery, we're going to start off with our low pressure system that's out over the Bering Sea, and we can see the frontal system associated with the main low draped out over the central Aleutians. And now as we watch this loop, we can watch that front push through the eastern Aleutian Islands and the parent low moving into the west of the Pribilof Islands as it goes. Watching this again, we can see some of that cloud cover making it along the west coast of the state. And behind this system, if you notice, we had some more cloud cover and another low coming in behind this system, bringing some cloud cover and rain to the western Aleutian Islands. Up along the Arctic coast, we're going to look out for a cold front slowly moving in, bringing some colder air to the area, especially along the farthest north places of the state around AKwx area. We're going to see actually some of the rain transition over to a rain and snow mix with that colder air coming in. And then finally we'll look out over the Panhandle area. Pretty clear out there, but if you notice to the south of the Panhandle, we do have a frontal system pushing into the area. However, we do expect that with high pressure dominating the Gulf of Alaska to get held up by that high and eventually track back to the south. So for the rest of today's weather, starting off again out over the Bering Sea, we have our main low to the west of the Pribilof Islands, attached to the low that's coming up or now forming out by the eastern Aleutian Islands, bringing that long fetch of southerly winds and moisture out over the Alaska Peninsula and up much of the west coast of the state, bringing rain to all of these locations. Behind this system, we have some rain coming in from a weaker low out by the western Aleutians, bringing some lighter rain to the Aleutians as these different systems pass through. But up along the west coast where our heavier rainfall is going to be, we start to mix that rain with fog as we get by the Norton Sound area, up to the Kotzebue Sound area, and then along the Arctic coastline as well at ahead of that cold front that's moving in. We'll have some showers in the Brooks Range and down into northern locations of the interior as well as eastern interior, but our high pressure dominating the Gulf of Alaska is keeping areas around south central and the Panhandle dry for today. Then as we look into tonight, high pressure has moved off to the east, now near the Panhandle area, still keeping the Panhandle dry and enough influence out over south central Alaska to keep that frontal system from pushing in far enough to bring rain to the area. However, we are expecting the development of some fog over Cook Inlet for tonight. If you notice to the south of the Panhandle, that system that we were tracking has really started to fall apart, and we're just seeing some light rain there, but not expecting that to push into the Panhandle area. Our frontal system, however, out over the Bering Sea is pushing right into the southwest coastline, still with that southerly flow out over the west coast, bringing rain from the Alaska Peninsula area, Kodiak Island, up through the west coast into the western interior, starting to mix with fog as we get by the Norton Sound area again, and then up the remainder of the west coast and the Arctic coastline. We're going to see that rain and fog mix, some of that rain making into the Brooks Range as well. And if you note, behind our cold front, we are going to see that mix of rain and snow starting to approach the Wainwright and AKwx areas. Then if we jump back to the west, we are going to see down in the Bering Sea, westerly flow behind our main front, bringing in some lighter rain to the Pribilof Islands and down into much of the Aleutian Islands as well. As we look into Thursday, our low out by the St. Lawrence Island area, not moving a whole lot anymore as that system is starting to weaken, but still enough for us to bring in more rain for all of the west coast, western interior down to southwest Alaska, Kodiak, and the Alaska Peninsula. Then also as far north into the Brooks Range and Arctic coastline, where we're going to see more rain and fog along the Arctic coastline, extending down the northwest coast and then down by the Bering Strait area as well. However, our high pressure out over the Panhandle is holding strong enough to keep the precipitation at bay from moving into the south central area or into the Panhandle, and then also for the eastern portions of the interior. Behind our low pressure system, we're going to continue to have westerly winds throughout the Bering and Aleutians with some lighter rain for the eastern Aleutian Islands, and then another system approaching the western Aleutians, bringing some rain to the area. Finally, as we move into Friday, we're going to have yet another system coming up by the western Aleutians, extending its front out through the central Aleutian Islands, bringing rain to these areas with some lighter rain out by the eastern Aleutians. Our old low is still remaining along the west coast of the state, continuing to bring rain for areas from the Alaska Peninsula up the west coast, western interior, through the Brooks Range and the Arctic coastline, bringing rain to all of those locations. Eastern portions of the interior still going to remain primarily dry for Friday. However, we are going to finally have some showers moving back into the south central area as our high pressure that was over the Panhandle has pushed back to the east. And then we are also going to have some showers now in the southern portions of the Panhandle, again as that high has pushed away. Then looking at our temperatures starting Thursday morning in the Panhandle area, dropping down into the lower to mid 50s. A little bit colder for Yakutat, 49 degrees is expected. Lower to mid 50s for much of the south central area, 52 for Kodiak. Then in the interior, dropping down into the lower to mid 50s, and that's going to be true throughout the western interior, down into southwest Alaska as well. But as we get by the Seward Peninsula, dropping down into the 40s, and in the 40s much of the Arctic coastline. However, as we look for the areas that are going to get hit most by that cold front moving through, such as Utqiagvik and Wainwright, dropping down into the mid 30s for those locations. Down in the Aleutian Islands, mid 40s are going to be expected, and then right around 50 degrees for the Pribilof Islands, with St. Paul right at 50. Thursday afternoon highs jumping back into the mid 50s for Pribilof Islands, right around 50 degrees for the Aleutians. Mid to upper 50s for the Bristol Bay area and Alaska Peninsula. That's going to extend up into the YK Delta area as well. As you move up the west coast, going to get colder as we get to the Kotzebue Sound area, in the 40s there. Then the 40s for the western locations of the Arctic coastline, but 50s as we get to the eastern locations. Down in the interior, Thursday is going to be one of our warmest days. We are going to see temperatures in the eastern interior getting up to right around 80 degrees, as well as down in the Copper River Basin where Glen Allen will get up to 79 degrees. Other locations around South Central will get into the mid-60s near the water and in the 70s as we get further away from the Gulf. And then in the Panhandle area, temperatures are going to rise into the mid to upper 70s, with the coolest temps closest towards the Gulf. Friday morning, temperatures in the Panhandle are going to drop back down into the mid-50s, lower 50s for south central Alaska, and then in the mid-50s for eastern locations of the interior, lower 50s for the western locations of the interior, down into southwest Alaska, where we'll see a lot of 50 degrees around the Bristol Bay area, with Dillingham and King Salmon both dropping down to 50 degrees. Up in the Kotzebue Sound area, dropping down into the 40s. However, Kotzebue itself is going to stay a little bit warmer, only dropping down to 52 degrees. Up along the Arctic coastline, temperatures out west dropping down into the mid-30s, out east staying in the lower 40s. Then finally down in the Aleutian Islands, dropping down into the mid-40s and in the lower 50s for the Pribilof Islands, with St. Paul getting down to 52 degrees. Friday afternoon, temperatures are coming back up into the lower to mid-50s for the Aleutian Islands, mid-50s for the Alaska Peninsula, upper 50s to lower 60s for southwest Alaska. And that's going to extend up into the western interior. We'll start to see more mid-60s and then into the mid-70s as we get closer towards the eastern interior. Some locations way out east getting up to 80 degrees once again on Friday. Up along the Arctic coastline, eastern locations in the 50s, whereas western locations are going to stay in the 40s. Kotzebue Sound, mid-40s are expected. Again, Kotzebue itself is going to be a little bit warmer, getting up to 56. Then in the south central area near the Gulf into the lower 60s, and then into the 70s as we get into the more interior locations. Down in the Panhandle area, 70s near the Gulf, and then into the mid to upper 70s for locations further to the north and more away from the Gulf.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
For aviation, we'll start off with a look at our flying weather for Thursday morning. Out over the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, widespread IFR conditions. And as the one system pushes into the west coast, we are seeing IFR conditions move into the west coast as well, especially down in southwest Alaska. A little break for the Seward Peninsula, but then up in the Brooks Range and Arctic coastline, more IFR conditions persist. In much of the interior, VFR conditions are expected, and in south central and the higher elevations, we're expecting some MVFR conditions, with VFR conditions at many of the lower elevations until we get along the North Gulf Coast where MVFR and IFR conditions are expected. Down in the Panhandle area, however, VFR conditions should persist through the morning. As we move into the afternoon, VFR conditions remaining for the Panhandle area, with IFR conditions out over the Gulf and MVFR conditions along the North Gulf Coast. The remainder of South Central Alaska should be VFR, and central and eastern portions of the rest of mainland Alaska also expected to be VFR. However, as we push further to the west, getting into MVFR conditions and eventually IFR along the coastline and up along the Arctic coast as well. Down in the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, more IFR conditions are expected. Moving into Friday morning, in VFR and IFR conditions throughout the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, still with IFR conditions along much of the west coast and MVFR conditions pushing into western portions of the mainland. However, central and eastern locations of the mainland still expected to be VFR Friday morning, with some MVFR conditions moving into the Kenai Peninsula. Down in the Panhandle area, once again, we're going to see VFR conditions for the area. And then moving into Friday afternoon, holding with those VFR conditions for the Panhandle with IFR conditions out over the Gulf of Alaska. Primarily VFR conditions for South Central Alaska and continuing to see VFR for central and eastern portions of the rest of the mainland. As we move to the western mainland, we are going to see MVFR and then IFR conditions along the west coast pushing into the YK Delta area, and then MVFR and IFR conditions throughout the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands. Moving into our passes, starting in the Brooks Range and AKwx should be IFR, improving to VFR conditions on Thursday. Adigan will also start off IFR, improve to VFR in the afternoon. Lake Clark will start off in VFR and stay that way throughout the day. However, Merrill also starting off in VFR, improving to VFR in the afternoon. Rainy should improve from MVFR to VFR conditions in the afternoon, as well as windy starting off marginal, improving to VFR. Isabel Pass also going to be marginal, improving to VFR, and Mentasta should be VFR throughout the day on Thursday. Tenita Pass also expected to be VFR throughout the day Thursday, and Portage should start off IFR, improving throughout the day, eventually getting to VFR in the afternoon. Chilkoot and White should be VFR throughout the day on Thursday. For our freezing levels, we see some colder air up along the Arctic coastline. Freezing levels down to 4,000 or even 2,000 feet just off the coastline. Down in the central portions of the Bering Sea, another pocket of colder air with freezing levels down to 6,000 feet. And then some warmer air out over the eastern portions of the Gulf of Alaska, getting up to 12,000 feet near the Panhandle area. So you look at our icing on Thursday all along the west coast with that system moving in above 7,000 feet from the eastern portions of the Bering to include the Pribilof Islands, up the west coast and all along the Arctic coastline as well. Taking a look at our jet, we can see the jet enforcing that low out over the eastern portions of the Bering Sea with a jet as high as 115 knots out of a westerly direction. Then becoming southerly over the western portions of the state, up to as high as 80 knots there, and then becoming westerly again, moving over the ridging and out of a westerly direction, 95 knots over northern portions of the state, strongest up along the Arctic coastline. And as we look down at 9,000 feet, out over the Aleutians, continuing to see that westerly flow, 35 knots over the western Aleutians, up to as high as 50 knots near the central and eastern Aleutians, and becoming southerly for much of the mainland, strongest over the southwest, up to as high as 65 knots out of that south direction, becoming westerly over northern portions of the state, 35 to 45 knots, strongest along the Arctic coastline. With high pressure over the Panhandle, weaker winds are expected there. And then with our low to the south of the area, easterly winds 30 knots, but should be staying well to the south of the Panhandle. Then down to 3,000 feet, pretty similar flow with high pressure out near the Panhandle area, keeping lighter winds over that area. But our low out over the eastern portions of the Bering going to continue to bring us westerly winds throughout the Aleutian Islands, 30 knots from most locations, a little bit weaker as we move further north in the Bering Sea by the Pribilofs, around 25 knots. Then becoming southerly once again out over the mainland part of the state. Southwest Alaska going to see the strongest of those southerly winds, up to as high as 45 knots, with weaker winds down by Kodiak down to around 30 knots. As we move up along the Arctic coastline, westerly winds 30 to 40 knots are expected. Turbulence around the Aleutians should be below 3,000 feet for the central and western and below 4,000 feet for the eastern. Then all throughout the western portions of the mainland down to Kodiak Island below 5,000 feet is expected.
Welcome to another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with the National Weather Service, and joining us today, two more people to talk about the augmented reality sandbox. It's Alana Valaji. She's a University of Alaska Fairbanks mechanical engineering student, helped design and work on the details to make this new type of sandbox there. Thanks for joining us, Alana. Thanks. And Courtney Breest, she's the outreach coordinator for AKwx, which is the experimental program to stimulate competitive research. It's a program funded nationally by the National Science Foundation, right?
Yes.
Okay. Alana, tell us about how you changed and adapted this version of the augmented reality sandbox. It's a really cool tool.
So Gina approached us with 3 goals for this new version of the sandbox. They wanted it to be compact in a light system that could travel around the state. They wanted it to be child-oriented, so we designed the sandbox to have 3 different levels.
Okay.
It's pretty cool. You can have younger children, you can have high school kids. I guess I should say high school teenagers.
Sure.
And then we also designed it to be more marketable, user-friendly, so that this could be seen eventually in classrooms all over the place, all over the state.
Okay. And you had a big hand in this, but this was a team approach, right?
Definitely. It was a really good experience for myself, for George Stevens, who we'll see later.
One of our hand models today. Yeah.
For 2 other members who aren't here today, Cody Klingman and Austin Hunt. And it was just a really good learning experience all around.
Very good. And this is something that is part of your learning experience as well, so you get to check a box in your education.
Yeah,
right?
it's a requirement for seniors of mechanical engineering at University of Alaska Fairbanks.
Very good. Very good. Well, it is a wonderfully inquisitive tool, fun to play with, and I hope to get my hands in the sand here in just a little bit. But it's also part of a bigger program, something that we were talking about a moment ago, AKwx, and that's what Courtney is here to tell us more about. What is AKwx and why do you need a sandbox?
Well, AKwx, as you mentioned, is a national program. We're funded nationally, but we're actually located statewide. We're at UAF, we're at UAA, we're in Southeast at UAS. And she mentioned, you know, taking the sandbox as an educational tool, and that's where I'm an outreach coordinator for the South Central test case.
Okay.
Our focus is on the Kenai watershed, and we are really interested in using these tools like the sandbox to interact with the students down there and get them interested in STEM and also communicate the research findings that we've been having throughout the state.
Okay. And one of those, as George and Eric are kind of changing the contours for us there from UAF to maybe something that resembles a little bit of something more of the Kenai watershed, which is one of your focuses for the study, right? And specifically looking at some of the changes there and how that impacts people and also the salmon.
Yes, it is all of our research is social and environmental.
Okay.
So we have social scientists working hand in hand with our environmental scientists. One of the things we're studying is Upper Russian Lake, and we have a researcher taking sediment cores from that lake. So one of the things we're going to use the sandbox to communicate is how the landscape changed over a long period of time, thousands of years, going from glacier, covered by glacier ice, to being filled with water. And then
that's what they're doing right now.
Exactly. So
live.
So they're moving the
cool.
water around. And then I think they've got some props over there, because we're also going to go a little bit more in depth and explain how the salmon got there.
Okay.
So using
and there's
these,
the salmon.
Exactly. Oh, I think there's a few more.
Yeah, we like more salmon in Alaska. More salmon.
Yeah, exactly. So it's really taking the findings from our research grant and just trying to connect with the community and translate it in a really hands-on and exciting way, so people can, you know, interact with us as much as possible.
Well, sure. That makes the learning and the science real and quite literally in your face, rather than just some boring black and white paper that you have to read about. This is something that people can understand better because it's visual and they're touching and feeling and seeing these changes, right?
Yeah, and get them engaged. And then outreach is a huge component, and working with the younger students, and actually even, I mean, working with the UAF graduate and engineering students it's a huge part of our grant, and we really enjoy it.
Oh, it is wonderfully exciting. And so, Alana, you were telling us that this is built to travel.
Right.
And this is built to do more things than version 1. Where can this type of project go in Alaska, and what can it demonstrate?
I mean, we were hoping to eventually get to villages that were harder to reach, that you couldn't necessarily move a whole fixed instrument to, right? You need something that can pack up, fit in your truck bed. I mean, one of the most attractive parts of this project is that this was going to be something that was used past our graduation point. You know, this is going to be something that lives in the state for years.
Right. Right. Well, it looks like you're well on your way with that. So what are, give me another example. What else can this show us? We've talked about the Kenai River watershed. What's the coolest thing that you've played in the sand with? What's your idea?
Well, I definitely enjoy the props, but we also like kind of building up a giant mound, and if you put some water behind it, you can make a little runway, I guess, and you know, demonstrate the effects of the hydrology by just putting up a dam and letting it all pour right down. And so that could, I think you mentioned it earlier, you could even demonstrate the effects of a tsunami.
Right.
Or something along those lines.
So it's not just topography, but it's also hydrology and coastal surge mapping and some of the coastal changes that we're seeing here in Alaska, and seeing what the smaller changes in the sandbox might do to kind of a real effect of a slosh or a push of water up on the coast. Tsunami inundation mapping, or even glacial dam release, as some has been demonstrated before. So wow, that's just an impressive thing. That it seems like the possibilities are nearly endless with this, and probably even more ideas that are popping up in your head too.
Yeah, as we speak.
Very cool. All right. Well, if folks want to get more information about EPSCoR, you guys are online. You're on Facebook, Twitter, and on YouTube. AKwx, right? EPSCoR, Alaska EPSCoR, that is. And again, you guys are funded by the National Science Foundation, so more to come from that, and a longer-term study there. Thank you, ladies, for joining us today. Congratulations on your hard work there. This is really fun. And for now, I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with this edition of Alaska Weather Facts, and I'm going to go play in the sandbox there. We'll see you next time.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
For our marine section, we'll start off with a look at our ice edge. We are continuing to see melting along the ice edge, and that's going to be true as we move forward in time as well. And then with the winds that we're seeing, we are expecting the ice pack to move away from the coastline along the Arctic coast to the north and east. But that is with the exception of any ice that is still grounded. However, over the weekend, we are expecting that ice to start push back towards the coastline. Taking a look now in southeast Alaska, southeast winds throughout the area. In the inside waters, it's 5 to 10 knots, and then in the Gulf as well, 5 to 10 knots are expected out of that southeast direction. Seas 3 to 4 feet in the Gulf. Then on Friday, in the inside waters, northerly winds in the north at around 15 knots, and then switching over and becoming southeasterly in the southern inside waters around 15 knots. In the Gulf, it's relatively variable winds, 5 knots in the north, then becoming southerly as we get into the eastern locations of the Gulf at 10 to 15 knots. Then out over south central areas, staying in the Gulf, we have variable winds 5 to 10 knots in northern locations, becoming more easterly to southeasterly as we get closer towards the Barren Islands, around 15 to 20 knots. Strongest winds are going to be west of the Barrens at 25 knots out of a southeasterly direction, seas as high as 9 feet there. Then in Cook Inlet, southwesterly winds 10 to 15 knots, and out over Prince William Sound, easterly winds 10 knots expected. Then on Friday, a more northerly direction for Prince William Sound and northern portions of the Gulf, around 5 to 10 knots, becoming more easterly to northeasterly as we get closer towards the Barren Islands, around 15 knots there. Easterly winds 15 knots west of the Barren Islands, and then Cook Inlet, north to northeast winds around 10 knots. For the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island area, starting off by Kodiak Island, southeasterly winds 20 to 25 knots, strongest through Shelikof Strait, becoming more southerly and then southwesterly as we push to the west, 20 to 25 knots, with seas up to as high as 10 feet, highest on the Pacific side. Then on Friday, we're going to see westerly winds on the Bering side, 10 to 20 knots, strongest to the west, becoming more northerly as we go into the Pacific side, 10 to 15 knots, northeasterly winds 15 knots through Shelikof Strait. Seas as high as 7 feet, highest in the western locations. On Thursday, we're going to see westerly winds for the central and eastern Aleutians, 20 to 25 knots, and southwesterly winds 20 knots out by the western Aleutian Islands. Seas as high as 9 feet nearest to the central and eastern Aleutian Islands. Then on Friday, for the western Aleutians, southerly winds 20 knots, Staying out of a southerly direction for the central Aleutian Islands, 15 knots expected there. Becoming more variable as we get over by the eastern Aleutian Islands, 10 to 15 knots are expected. Along the west coast, we're going to see circulation around our low pressure system, so down by the Pribilof Islands, westerly winds 20 knots, becoming southwesterly near the coast, 15 to 20 knots. By St. Matthew Island, northwesterly winds 15 knots. And then east to southeast as we get by St. Lawrence Island and the Norton Sound area, 15 knots expected there. Seas as high as 7 feet, highest by the Pribilof Islands. Then on Friday in the Norton Sound area, southerly winds 15 knots, becoming northerly by St. Lawrence Island, 20 knots. Southwesterly winds along the coastline, 10 to 15 knots. Northerly winds 15 knots by St. Matthew Island, and westerly winds 20 knots by the Pribilofs. Up along the Arctic coastline, westerly winds 10 to 15 knots are expected, becoming more variable down the west coast of the state, around 10 knots there, and through the Bering Strait area, easterly winds 15 knots are expected. Then on Friday, northerly winds all along the coastline, or the west coast, 15 to 20 knots, diminishing as we get further to the north, becoming more northeasterly, around 10 knots for the Arctic coastline. For a recap of tonight's weather, we have a low pressure system moving into the northeastern portions of the Bering Sea, extending its frontal system out over the southwest coastline, bringing rain to areas all throughout the southwest coast into the western interior, up the west coast of the state, mixing with fog by the Seward Peninsula and in the Norton Sound area, and then a mixture of rain and snow along the Arctic coastline as well, with the exception of the Utqiagvik area where we are going to see a cold front pushing in that's going to mix the rain with snow. For the eastern and central places of the interior, high pressure will be enough to keep the area pretty dry. That's going to be true down in south central as well. However, we will have some fog forming for the Cook Inlet area, then high pressure out over the Panhandle area, going to keep the Panhandle dry. Behind our frontal system out over the Bering and Aleutians, westerly flow will bring some lighter rain to the eastern Aleutians and Pribilof Islands. For Thursday, we're going to see continued westerly winds out over the Bering Sea, some lighter rain out for the Pribilof Islands, the western Aleutians, and for the eastern Aleutians. However, our low pressure that was over the northeastern portion of the Bering is going to stay relatively in the same place, with its front breaking down now, but still enough to bring rain for the Alaska Peninsula up through the west coast and the western interior through the Brooks Range and along the Arctic coastline. We'll see a mixture of rain and fog from the Arctic coastline down through the Seward Peninsula area. Alaska Weather, I'm David Kramer.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.